Good morning again. Can you hear me? Because last time there was a screw up. Can somebody speak? And can you hear me?
I
Hello.
can hear you. Yeah, I can
Yes.
hear you.
So you can hear me and I can hear you. Good. Okay. The agenda today is we're going to complete our discussion of Indian culture and history. And then we're going to review, I think there are 5 questions amongst the review questions on Indian history. So that's the agenda. And of course, beyond that, we're going to do China, and then we're going to return to the development of the West and its capitalism and colonialism, and sort of explain more fully why it was. You've already seen the conquest of Latin America, the subordination of the Ottoman Empire. Today, we're going to see the conquest of the Indian subcontinent and so on. The triumph of the West is rooted in the internal dynamic of Western society. So that is what we're going to do. And in the course of that, we're going to also deal with the Western intrusion into Africa and slavery. So that's the agenda for the rest of the term. Now, in terms of, I just want to, yes, I've been reading about a book. I guess I'm going to get it out of the library, but I've been reading about it. I've heard of it. It's by a guy named Sheldon Wolin, who is a professor of political science at Berkeley. Now, I haven't been dealing with current events, except for this beginning of the semester. I made reference. And we've seen the truckers' protests, and we've seen now the war in Ukraine. And I'm not commenting directly on that. I mentioned the role of the media in sort of shaping public opinion. Indeed, I would say controlling public opinion. And I mentioned Chomsky's work, Managing Consent, and I mentioned Althusser, Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus. And Wolin has written a book called Inverted Totalitarianism, which seems inverted totalitarianism. When you think of totalitarianism, you think of fascism, and perhaps some of you think of communism. But what Wolin argues is that in fact, the United States of America, and by extension, Canada, have themselves become totalitarian in the sense that the giant corporations and the mass media and the internet, which they control, has basically come to dominate a society like the United States or Canada, and the democratic process, that is to say, the sort of constitutional order, has become subordinated to these gigantic structures, and that in effect the sort of political democracy within these structures has become a kind of managed democracy, where the really important issues never really get discussed. And basically, popular participation is reduced to basically voting, and the political parties' actual policies are very similar to one another across the spectrum. And the system is a kind of self-enclosed system controlled by these economic and political elites. And I think this is apropos to really the society that we are now living in. I would say that's certainly true of the United States, and I would argue that it's also true of Canada. I'm not going to say anything else. So now I want to come back to India, and I began to discuss the decline of India last time, and I mentioned the fact that number one, I think, in terms of explaining the decline of the Mughal Empire within India, is overexploitation. The tax levels between the reign of Akbar and the reign of Aurangzeb, that's to say the late 16th and the late 17th century, increased dramatically, 2.5 times on the peasantry. And of course, this is enjoyed by the mansabdars because it financed their extremely luxurious way of life, but the common people suffered. And I would say, in terms of explaining the popular protest, this is very important. The second factor in the decline of the Mughals is the sort of breakdown. Yes, Mr. Johnson. Nothing? Just, okay. The second factor is the breakdown in the sort of administrative structure, which, as I explained, you have the villages, and of course, to a certain extent, there's towns and cities. But then in the villages, it's these zamindars, the local elites, who collect the tribute from the common people, from the peasants, and they're obliged to ship most of it up to the mansabdars and to the emperor. Well, by the late 17th century, they begin to resist. They want to keep more of the tribute for themselves, or they become champions of the popular cause of the resistance against the upper elites in the society. So there is this, and as we'll see, the revolts that do break out at the end of the 17th century are led by the zamindars. So that's the second factor, the split between the mansabdars and the zamindars. A third factor is the fact that the villages had no real connection with, other than paying tribute, they had no real connection with the state. As I explained, they were autarkic or self-sufficient communities. There was no market exchange. And as you know, a market sort of binds the state together. And without a market, the state at its base was quite weak. The people had no real connection with the state. So that's the third factor. And finally, the last factor, which I sort of left off with, was the development of opposition to the Mughals, which took a religious form. I began to talk about the development of religious dissent. And I noted that at the beginning of the 16th century, this started. And it took the form, this dissent. I'm looking for, 1 second while I find my place. Can you see that on the screen? Bhakti is the name of this religious ascent. Bakhti. Can you see that on the screen?
Yes,
Hello?
we can. Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. So bhakti, and this is this kind of religiosity is essentially personal religiosity, in which the individual has a personal connection with
Professor,
with the divinity. Yes.
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure why on my screen it shows a whole different Word document. It's like one review press and Clementine Wallace, the Canadian corporate
No,
abuse.
I'll hold on. I'll stop sharing and I'll try and.
Okay.
Can you see that now? Is the different screen come up?
Yeah, this one.
Bhakti?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Thank
this
you.
bhakti is this personal religiosity between the individual and God, which makes the point that bhakti religion was monotheistic. The people who held to this view, um, this kind of spirituality, believed in a single God. Obviously, that has the influence here is Muslim and so on, but nevertheless, the people who practiced bhakti didn't conform either to the practices of Brahmin-controlled Hinduism or to the official religion of Islam. They had a personal religion, and it was inspired by sort of mystical traditions that you find both in the Muslim religion and the Hindu religion. So what I'm saying is that the people who began to practice this kind of religion and to follow its leaders, they essentially rejected caste, they rejected ritual, they rejected the Brahmins, they rejected the whole sort of religious literature, the Vedas, and the other religious texts of Hinduism, which are written in a language that common people could not understand. Rather, the people who led this movement spoke in the ordinary languages of the people, Bengali or Hindi, which people understood. And finally, the people who led this movement came from the craftsmen and from the ordinary people. They were not upper caste, they were not Brahmins. They were ordinary and indeed simple and poor people. And so this kind of religions began to spread at the beginning of the 16th century. And I would say that it's comparable to Protestantism in Europe as against the Catholic Church. Here you have basically a protest movement which is rejecting the official religions, Hinduism, Brahmanism, and official Islam. And I noted that the most important and the first of these individuals was a man by the name of Kabir. And we don't know that much about Kabir, but he became and still is extremely popular in India. India is still a very religious society, and Kabir is venerated. And it is not known whether he was either a Hindu or a Muslim, which is interesting in itself. But there were others as well. I mentioned Nanak, who essentially founded the Sikh religion. And of course, it's important to mention this because, of course, in Canada, the Sikhs are a significant group in Canada. But there were a number of others from the common people. One was a printer of textiles. One was a scavenger in the garbage heaps. One was a barber. One was kind of a carter in the manufacture of cotton and so on. And these people promoted this idea of bhakti, which became more and more popular. Incidentally, I want to say something just a bit about the people who become leaders in society. This is a generalization I'm making. I have been stressing in these lectures, obviously I'm stressing politics and economics, social factors, and of course these are clearly decisive. So the question arises, well, do individuals, as individuals, have any effect on society? Can individuals actually change society? And I would answer the answer, and of course, I mean, in this case, I'm dealing with these religious and cultural leaders, but we could also talk about political leaders as well. They can, that individuals can have an effect. And I would say that what spells the difference, what makes individuals important is if they put themselves ahead of important social and political movements in society. And that is to say, individuals who have some sort of sense of where society is going, whether it's social or political, etc., and who provide leadership to these underlying currents, they emerge as the leaders. On the other hand, you could have very brilliant and very passionate leaders who promote ideas or feelings or currents in society which are against the grain, which are going nowhere, essentially, which are basically ideas which are out of time and out of place. Well, people who, they may be as brilliant as you like, or as magnetic as you like, but they essentially go nowhere. So I introduced that, and of course it's a generalization which can be applied beyond what we're currently discussing. In any case, by the beginning of the 17th century, we see in the Ganges River Valley, and I've shown you that on the map, a group of people who were attracted to the ideas of Kabir actually formed an organized religion, a sect, if you like, which was contrary to Islam. It was essentially against both Brahmanism and against Islam. This sect became a sort of forerunner of a whole lot of other sects which began to emerge in the course of the 17th century. And they were, as I say, religious, but they had they were against the established religions, Hinduism and Islam, but they clearly also were against the empire and against the state, against the Moguls. They were resisting. And what is significant about this is that whereas in Europe, or later on, as we'll see in China, the opposition movements, there were sects. Like we could point out the fact that, say, in 16th century Europe, we have the Anabaptists, who were the forerunners of the Mennonites, who are a kind of religious sect, or we have the Hutterites. That's true. But in the main, in Europe, it's economic classes, the lower classes, the peasants, the craftsmen, the workers, who rise up as a class against the upper classes and the state. In India, the dissent takes the form either of one of these religious sects, and that is because religion is so important in Indian society, or it's some sort of group that tries to break away from the centralized government. And this is what we see in the late 17th and early 18th century. The Mughal Empire breaks up, and one of the great factors in this is the rise of these religious dissident groups or separatist groups within Indian society. Are there any questions about what I've said? Okay, now we saw with Akbar in the late 16th century that Akbar was tolerant. Of course, he was a Muslim, but he tolerated. He was even interested in what the Hindus believed, what the Christian believed, what the Jews believed. He was open to discussion. He invited people to the court. He even reduced taxes on the non-Muslim people. There were religious taxes, just like in the Ottoman Empire. There were these religious taxes on non-believers, people who were not Muslims. Well, Akbar reduced these taxes on people, but things became very different during the long reign of, I think it was his great-grandson, Aurangzeb, 1658 to 1707. And this king, this emperor, one of the things he did succeed in doing at much cost was to eliminate the sort of independent state of Vishnanagara, which had dominated southern India. This huge army that he controlled, the Mughals crushed the Vishnagara kingdom under Aurangzeb. But in the course of doing this, Aurangzeb initiated, he was putting down this Hindu kingdom, but he initiated a general persecution of the Hindu population. And he raised taxes on infidels, on non-believers, on the Hindus and the other people who practice different religion. And as a result of that, you have a whole series of rebellions that break out in India, amongst the certainly the Hindus, and the most important of these is in a place called Maharashtra, which is in western central India. There, under the leadership of an individual by the name of Savaji, the peasants, the craftsmen, led by the zamindars, the Hindu zamindars, rebel against Aurangzeb, and they carry on this rebellion for years. And it's never really suppressed by Aurangzeb. This is the first. But then we see that at the beginning of the 18th century, the Satnamis, these followers of Kabir in the Ganges river valley, they also revolt. And then as Aurangzeb's reign begins to come to an end, there are all sorts of rebellions that break out, particularly in northern India, including the Sikhs, the Jats, and all sorts of other groups who rebel. And as I said, these rebellions tend to be led by zamindars. And what's another notable feature is that by this time, the peasants who make up the rank and file of these rebellions are able to make their own guns. They make muskets and even primitive cannon. So I'm just bringing in the fact that the conflict, the military conflict, assumes a more modern form in the course of these struggles. And the result of all this is that by the time you get to the end of Aurangzeb's rule, many of the provinces are beginning, especially the ones where the Hindus are strong, they begin to separate from the Mughal Empire, and the central government is unable to control this movement. And so after Aurangzeb dies, essentially India breaks up into different separate states. The Mughal emperors remain in Delhi, but they are no longer in control of India. And this period is a period of constant warfare between these different states. There's chaos, but at the same time, along the coast, as a matter of fact, the coast of it, the East Coast and the West Coast, there's a lot of commercial and manufacturing activity, particularly in relationship to the manufacture of goods for export to Europe, because European merchants, the Dutch to a certain extent, the French, and above all the English, are beginning to move in. And they are able to sort of make deals with these local rulers who protect them. And they begin to develop this commercial activity, of course, in partnership with Indian merchants and bankers. And so for this reason, one of the trends in the writing of history recently, in writing about Indian history, is that some historians claim that India really in the midst of the violence on the coast, there was a commercial boom in India, and some historians go so far as to claim that it might have turned into capitalism. I have my doubts about that, but nevertheless, this is the argument, and I'm giving it to you. It's important to note, you see, the disunity, the breakdown of unity facilitates a European penetration. Under Akbar, that would not have been possible. You had simply the Portuguese on the west coast at Goa, and that was about it, so far as foreigners went. But with this growing disunity, the European merchants begin to become more prominent. Now, with regard to that, we should note, first of all, that the Portuguese was still there at the beginning of the 18th century. They held on to Goa, and they in fact, were to hold on to Goa until 1975, if you can believe it. So there was this Portuguese enclave. But the Portuguese were no longer a factor because the Portuguese Empire, basically, it withered at the end of the 16th century. The Dutch began to move in, and the Dutch basically took over Indonesia in the course of the 17th century. The Portuguese were eliminated. And also off the coast of India, there's an island called, an estate called Sri Lanka. They took over the Dutch, took over that in the 17th century as well. Now, so the Dutch were, in terms of the Asian trade, I would say in the 17th century, of the European powers, the Dutch were the most important. And we'll talk about that further when we come back to Europe. But already from the beginning of the 17th century, the English began to become more prominent. And the English appeared at the beginning of the 17th century in India, but also in Indonesia, in the form of the East India Company. The East India Company, this is really important, the East India Company. Now, the Dutch themselves, the way they operated was through the Dutch East India Company. The English were merely imitating. I believe the English East India Company was founded in 1599, several years after the Dutch created the Dutch East India Company. And they sort of imitated what the Dutch were doing. But England at the beginning of the 17th century did not have as many ships. It was not as powerful from a commercial point of view, from the point of view of the amount of money or capital that the English merchants had. And even in terms of fighting, the Dutch were superior to the English at the beginning of the 17th century. Of course, this all changed by the end of the 17th century, but we're talking about the beginning. So the first place that the English tried to penetrate was Indonesia, where the Dutch were established at this point. And there was essentially a war between the Dutch and the English in Indonesia during the 1620s, and the Dutch won the war. The English were humiliated and driven out. And so they began to focus on India in the course of the 17th century. They began to focus on India, and they kept out of politics. They established trading posts, if you like, or factories, as they were called, trading posts, and they focused on trade, on exporting the luxury goods, the fine products that the Indians manufactured. And they basically tried to get along with the local rulers, to make deals with the local rulers. They conformed to the local rules, to the rules of the local markets, and so on. And at this time, we can say that the English and the French also become a presence by the end of the 17th and 18th centuries. They're the two main European presences in India by the beginning of the 18th century, the French and the English. As I say, they concentrate on trading, and by the third, fourth decade of the 18th century, the English have no less than 150 trading posts along the coast of India, or as they call them, factories. And what are they interested in? They like Indian silks. They like Indian sugar. They like Indian rice. They like Indian saltpeter. They like Indian opium, which is popular, especially in Asia and to a certain extent even in England. But above all, they like Indian cotton goods. I've already mentioned this. Indian cottons, muslins, um, uh, um, uh, and denims and other Indian cotton goods. So much so that by the late 17th and 18th century, the European markets are flooded with these, especially these English cotton goods, which are preferred to wool. You can imagine they would be preferred. Wool, silk, cotton is the favorite fabric in Europe, and the Indians manufacture it. So the Indians have a huge balance of trade surplus with Europe in the first part of the 18th century. And the Europeans, the poor Europeans, only have gold and weapons to send to India. They don't really have much to sell the Indians in return. And this is seen by the European governments as a real problem. It is an important spur to the development of cotton textile manufacturing in Europe. The Indians, of course, manufactured their cotton with cheap hand manufacturing. Labor was so cheap in India. And so the Indian manufacturers were basically hand manufacturers, while the Europeans in the late 18th century began to experiment with machine manufacturing, as we'll see. But that's another story. I'm going to get into it later. In any case, you can see that the English were forging ahead. And the most important place where they did their business was the city of Calcutta on the east coast, toward the north, on the east coast of India. This city, Calcutta, which, along with Bombay, are the two main cities of India. And Calcutta is this enormous city filled with poor people who basically sell their labor to make a living. And it was even so in the 18th century, and this became the main English settlement. Now, the ruler of this city, the local authority was called the Nabob, as in the Canadian coffee. You've heard of Nabob coffee? Well, it's named after these local rulers in India, known as Nabobs. The Nabob of Calcutta was whom the English dealt with. Well, they got into a quarrel. The Nabob and the English began to quarrel. The Nabob wanted more in the way of taxes, and the English refused. And so the English East India Company entered into alliances with some of the local zamindars. Again, the zamindars. At the same time, also some of the rich merchants and bankers sided with the English. And so a war broke out, and the English East India Company, they had an army of about 5,000 men at this point, trained and equipped in the European fashion. And I'll be mentioning this later, by the late 18th century, these European armies, they of course don't resemble in any respect of what we see today, the way of military, but they were extremely well organized and disciplined to an unprecedented degree. And they were equipped with, by this time, very powerful rifles and cannon. And they knew all of the techniques of marching and counter-marching, firing and volley. I'll illustrate this in later lecture. And the Nabob, he got in contact with the French, who were located further south, and some of the other local princes, and they tried to organize an army against the English East India Company. And at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the French and the Nabob went down to a decisive defeat. So the English East India Company, which had previously kept its nose out of politics, now it becomes very interested. Realizing its military power, it becomes very interested in politics. And so they initiate a campaign of conquest, allying themselves with certain princes, because, as I've explained, India is divided. So the English East India Company makes alliances with certain princes, with certain local rulers, and makes enemies of others. But using their military force, using some of the local Indian forces, the English East India Company, first of all, conquers in the succeeding decades in a campaign of great violence. I want to stress that. Carnage and violence. These people are ruthless. I'm talking about the English capitalists. And they ravage, they plunder the whole of Bengal, and then the whole of northern India. Now, certainly the Indians put up a vigorous resistance in some cases, but in the end, the French and the Indians were not able to stop the offensive of the English East India Company. And by 1800, the English East India Company had basically conquered the whole of India. And as I say, this was this was not a sort of an establishment of an administration. That would come later. The English would administer, they would bring in governors, they would bring in administrators and so on. But this was basically ruthless conquest and plunder. And they forced the populations to pay enormous penalties. And a lot of this money found its way back in the form of private fortunes. Great fortunes were made by the officers of the English East India Company, including the military officers. As so much so that it is said, it is argued, and I think convincingly, that a significant part of the capital that was deposited in the banks by these people was used to finance the English Industrial Revolution, which was fully underway at this point. So Indian plunder is used to finance the English Industrial Revolution. And the second thing, of course, is that the English were also engaged in war against the French. I've alluded to this already in India. But in fact, they were fighting the French in North America and on the high seas and in Europe all through this period. And these wars between the French and the English financed these wars, partly by what they got out of India. And of course, the Industrial Revolution and the defeat of the French made England the greatest power in the world. So these are really decisive English victories. This is really the point where England becomes the ascendant power in the world. Now, when after the smoke cleared, after the English finally established steady rule, the English East India Company continued to rule. It was a private company. Recall that in Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company, they didn't have to do in conquering central and western Canada. They didn't have to resort to this incredible violence, but much the same thing is happening. What you have here are private companies, corporations, in the full sense of the word, limited liability and open to basically private shareholders who have no sort of immediate connection with the business, but who provide their capital. Well, that's the nature of the Hudson's Bay Company. It's the nature of the East India Company. Well, this private company in India basically takes over India. And until the middle of the 19th century, that was the way India was governed. Because the British, they didn't want, the English Parliament didn't want to spend the money on governing India. And it believed in free enterprise. And so, yes, let the English East India Company do. So what was, I still have a few minutes left. What was the net effect of the English rule? Well, the English established private property by law. There was no private property in India, just as there was no private property in the Ottoman Empire. Well, English law set up private property, and therefore real landlords developed in India during that is to say, a definite landed class, which didn't exist before. Everybody who held land, all the land was held by the emperor, and landholding was contingent. The Indians provided huge numbers of troops for the English colonial empire. By the middle of the 19th century, the East India Company alone had 200,000 troops, and many of these troops were lent out to deal with unrest in other parts of the English of the British Empire. The English did build a railway system, and they set up a modern school system, and basically that provided the basis for the development in India during the 19th century of a middle class. We can say all of these things are true. But on the other hand, India was brutally exploited by India. It was the jewel of the empire because the surpluses in India were basically shipped to England. The manufacturing, the cotton manufacturing, all of that was obliterated by English manufacturing. And India became a very poor, overpopulated country as a result. So that to end, we see that in 1756, just prior to Plassey, the Indian gross domestic product was 26% of the world's gross domestic product. In 1949, when India achieved its independence, Indian gross domestic product was 4% of world GDP. And so we'll see you next time And we'll do some review questions and then turn to China.